Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's launch of the
Donnie, I'm not.
Sorry, Taitu. I have to remember to mute everything. We would like to take this time and again welcome everybody to the launch of the legislative review of restrictive provisions governing women's access to abortion in the Eastern Caribbean. This project was done under the Equality Justice Alliance program that is funded by the UK government, funds that came about through and by the UK government after a deep regret for the colonial history being left behind in this region. This project, which was a 2-year project, gave us an opportunity here in the Caribbean, in the Pacific as well as in Africa, for civil society to develop their own projects that allowed us to look at the issues that were affecting us, looking at the issues that we wanted to take forward around legislative reform and basically advocacy. And under this project, we are happy that we're able to deal with 3 streams, one being abortion. And if you joined us before, you would have heard the launch of the legal gap analysis on mental health. And the other one we have coming up soon will actually be the legal literacy manual, also done. So our 3 strains that we worked deeply on was the mental health, abortion, and anti-discrimination. And we are very happy to have been able to do the legal aspect because, you know, half of this is about knowing what the laws in the countries are. How do we actually advocate and use this information to either request amendments or request improvements, or even new legislation in the law to ensure we are actually protecting the communities that we are advocating for. So it's really a pleasure to be able to be here with the lead on the abortion project, which is Taitu Heron here, leading out of WAND in UE, Barbados. And she will actually give us an overview of what the abortion aspect was, the abortion team was able to accomplish. And she will then introduce the lawyer who have taken time to really go through the legislation. And after the 2 presentations, we'll be able to answer all questions. In the meantime, during presentation, you can type questions in the chat. I'll be following it up and making sure it's answered. But just know that we will also be opening up totally for questions after the presentation. So Taitu, it has really been a pleasure working with you fully on this for the last 2 years. And you know, it's good to see that we can actually celebrate the fruit of the hard work. And
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kenita. It's been a pleasure indeed. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are glad to be at this point. The abortion subgroup or some component of this project, this 2-year project, has really sought to conduct research in 2 areas looking at abortion in the Eastern Caribbean. And what we had done is we identified those 2 areas that would address gaps, not just in law, but also on the ground. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was to make sure that the research that was conducted, we would be able to use the research rather to strengthen civil society's ability to advocate for law reform and also to advocate for policy frameworks, improved policy frameworks in sexual and reproductive health services for women and adolescent girls. And as you know, most of the Caribbean, with the exception of Barbados and Guyana, has abortion on the table as being is restrictive. So one of the main things for this particular aspect of the research was really to look at what the restrictive legislation looked like in 6 of the countries in the Eastern Caribbean, and then do some kind of comparison with Barbados and Guyana. We also wanted to be able to pay attention to the heteronormative structure of the law, in the sense that the law in a way assumes that all unions, or the way that women, have babies, so to speak, are just based on man and woman relationships. So we wanted to look at how does this then impact women in a more diverse way, whether they were straight, lesbian, bisexual, queer, non-conforming, etc., and pay attention to the different ways in which barriers may exist that surpassed just straight biology, and if there were social or procedural barriers, so to speak, that limited not access to abortion care, but if there were procedural or legal barriers that women in their diversities that were being limited by. And so we had formed what is called an abortion technical working group, which was led by the Women and Development Unit of UA Open Campus. And then that technical working group consisted of several NGOs and representatives from NGOs, as well as across the Eastern Caribbean. And I'm seeing that quite a few of them are on the line now. So I'd like to take the time to acknowledge Alexandria Wong from Antigua, Kelly Knight in Barbados. I'm not seeing everybody now. I'm having several screens up, but I noticed before, I see that St. Vincent is in the house. I'm seeing St. Kitts in the house. I'm seeing Grenada in the house. I'm seeing quite a few persons who are here that are part of the abortion technical working group, which essentially guided the process along. And we had, internal discussions. WhatsApp is a wonderful thing to, in a sense, steer the research. And so once we had that general framework, we went ahead and went through the whole process of finding who should do the research and so on. And Anika was one of the consultants that we had worked with that brought us to where we are now, which is to look at the legislation and how restrictive it is in 6 countries in the Eastern Caribbean. And while we have this, because of the illegality or the gray area in procuring abortion from this old law, its provisions in the Offences and Persons Against the Persons Act of 1864, we wanted to be able to use this analysis, so to speak, that Anika is going to get into, to not just pay attention to the legal and the restrictive barriers, but what are the recommendations across territories that we can stand on to make advocacy movements and recommendations going forward with our respective states, or even at the regional level. So those are in a sense, the general framework in which we operated to get the research done. But Anika is the primary author, so I would prefer if she just goes full speed into what the findings were of the research. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Anika Gray, the consultant, and Anika is at the Faculty of Law at the University of West Indies in Mona. Anika, over to you.
So hi, good morning, everyone. Is everybody seeing the screen? Yes? Okay, great. So first of all, let me apologize upfront. The video on my computer is not working, and so you won't be able to see me, but of course you have the PowerPoint presentation to look at as I speak. So what I want to do is, this morning is to give you a summary of the review's content with highlights of specific areas. And before I begin, I would like to make it clear that the review looks specifically at the legal framework for abortion laws and does not purport to give an authoritative assessment of the policy context. And so insofar as we relied on policy research, it was only to inform how the existing laws can impact women and girls. And the available research that we did rely on the policy context at the time of doing the review was also very sparse and not entirely recent. So let's begin. So the review does 5 things. First, it outlines the legislative framework for abortion in 6 Eastern Caribbean countries. Secondly, it explains current international jurisprudence on abortion. Third, it demonstrates the impact of abortion laws on women and girls. Fourth, it examines the legal regime for abortion in Barbados and Guyana in order to do a comparative analysis. And finally, it recommends reforms for the current legal regime on abortion in the 6 Eastern Caribbean countries. What I will now do is I will now highlight specific parts from each of the 5 sections that I just mentioned. So under the legislative framework for each of the 6 Eastern Caribbean countries, namely Antigua and Barbuda, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Grenada, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we found that there were exceptions to the broad prohibition against abortion, and worldwide countries fall within a spectrum in relation to the general circumstances under which abortion becomes available. So you have at one extreme those countries that put a total ban on abortion, and at the other extreme you have a few countries which allow it without the need to provide justification. That is, it is made available on demand. And then you have the rest of the countries which fall into the large middle ground with a mixture of exceptions. Now, all 6 Eastern Caribbean countries that I just mentioned have the life as well as mental and physical health exceptions in their legal framework, but only St. Lucia and St. Vincent provide abortion in cases of fetal impairment and also in cases of rape or incest. We also looked at international law and the international obligations of the 6 Eastern Caribbean countries. And we did this to contextualize the extent to which these laws are in violation of human rights standards regarding women's and girls' rights to access safe and affordable abortion. Now, as far as the international framework goes, the jurisprudence had quite a bit to say about the following. So we would have broken them down into 4 specific areas. So in relation to 5 specific areas, sorry. So in relation to criminalization of women, girls, and healthcare providers, the international jurisprudence says that this sort of criminalization amounts to a breach of the right to equality or non-discrimination on the grounds of sex or gender. As it relates to abortion not being available for rape or incest, or even in the case of fetal impairment, this based on international jurisprudence, international law says that this non-availability of abortion in those specific cases amounts to a breach of the rights to privacy, and also amounts to cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. As it relates to policies and procedures which are barriers to accessing safe, affordable, and lawful abortion, what the international jurisprudence says is that even where states have legislation in place to provide abortion, states have a positive obligation to not only have this sort of legislation in place for access, but they have a positive obligation to put in place procedures and policies to guarantee safe, timely, readily available, and affordable abortion services. So there has to be a complement between the law as it relates to the black and white letter of the law, and how that law impacts people in practice. In relation to girls' access to abortion, the international jurisprudence says that girls have a right to also access safe abortion services as part of the protection of their reproductive and sexual health rights. And finally, in relation to the rights of the unborn and in relation to the rights of the man or the person who would have impregnated the woman, there are three main things that the international jurisprudence is currently saying. The first is that abortion is a justifiable exception to the right to life, to the general right to life. And secondly, the life of the unborn cannot trump the right of a woman to a lawful abortion. And finally, men do not have the right to be consulted or the right to be given a veto vote in relation to a woman's decision to conduct or carry out an abortion. So we also looked at the impact of the abortion laws on women and girls within the specific Eastern Caribbean countries that were listed earlier. So the restrictive laws in the EC countries impact women and girls in three general ways. So the first is that they perpetuate gender inequality. The second is that they pose health risk. And third, they violate the human rights of women and girls in those countries. Now, we also looked at the specific ways these violations would manifest themselves within the different countries. So, for example, the limitation on access to abortion services caused by the limited justifications or the limited reasons, as well as the need for medical authorization of more than one or two doctors in some cases, and the availability or the limited availability of late-term abortion, all amount to a limitation, an unjustifiable limitation on the rights of women to access safe and affordable abortion services. There's also the issue of the unfettered power doctors have in restrictive regimes to decide which woman gets to have an abortion. And in some cases, women are not able, because the abortion regime is so restrictive and because a lot of the abortions happen in so-called illegal circumstances, women are not able to have redress in cases where things go wrong. So other specific impact include, without express right to access to abortion services, adolescent girls face significant barriers in relation to accessing those services. Secondly, persons are more likely to engage in unsafe abortions. So within restrictive regimes, women and girls are more likely to engage in unsafe abortions that can cause maternal mortality and morbidity. There's also the issue of, in restrictive regimes where abortion services are not available in relation to rape or incest, it leaves a lot of women and girls unprotected from the effects of sexual violence. And as we know, within the Caribbean, the levels of sexual violence perpetrated against women and especially girls is very high, especially where the perpetrators include family members and acquaintances. Now, in relation to, we also found that the way in which abortion is talked about, or even the way in which it is, even in the way we advocate for it, there is an assumption that it is only for heterosexual women. And so lesbian and bisexual women are sort of invisible in the conversations related to abortion. And finally, we saw where having the restrictive laws on the books reinforces the existing stigma as it relates to women and girls who do decide to have an abortion. Now, we also did a comparative assessment of the more progressive regimes in Barbados and Guyana. And I'm not going to go into much detail in terms of what the specific details of the laws in these countries are, because when you do read the research, you'll be able to get an understanding of that. But what I want to do is I want to show you the different legs or the different areas that we use to conduct the comparative analysis in order to demonstrate what the key features of the regime in both countries look like. And these key features relates to gestational limits and medical authorization, reasons for abortion, the existence or the use of authorized facility, access for girls, counseling, the availability of a policy framework that demands monitoring and evaluation of how abortion services are conducted, as well as we also looked at the legal framework. And just to say briefly, in terms of the reasons that are available for abortion in Guyana, for example, they have they give wide scope in terms of the reasons for abortion, up to, so for example, up to a certain point in your pregnancy, so up to 12 weeks, you actually do not have to give any reasons as to why you want the abortion. You can simply request it. In relation to, and this is just briefly, it's not going in details. So in relation to access for girls, for example, Guyana provides access, provides that girls are able to access, that is, girls 16 and over are able to access an abortion without parental authorization. And of course, in both Guyana and Barbados, there are provisions for counseling. The provisions in relation to counseling are a lot more progressive in Guyana than they are in Barbados, because the legislation does not specifically speak to how counseling would play out in Barbados, and it leaves it in the hands of the minister to determine. And this is very different from what happens in Guyana. Again, in relation to monitoring, Barbados decided to leave the decision as to how monitoring should be conducted to the minister to the minister with responsibility for health. In Guyana, the legislation specifically states what is to be monitored and who is to conduct the monitoring. So those are just examples of the different features of the Guyanese and Barbados legislation. And as I said before, I'm not going into details because the details are included in the research, and we have limited time this morning. So finally, we ended the research, or the final part of the research is that we provided 8 recommendations for reforming the legal framework for abortion in the 6 mentioned OECS countries. So the first recommendation that we made was that abortions be made available without restrictions on the reasons for having the abortion. So women and girls should be able to access an abortion without having to give any sort of legal justification. Now, the second recommendation is that there should be access to abortion services at any private or public facilities. So there should be no designated authorized facility for having an abortion, because what we saw from the limited research that we were able to access is that having a designated authorized facility actually prevents women from accessing abortion because of the existing societal stigma related to abortion. And so what we are asking for, or what we are recommending, is that access to an abortion should be done at any private or public facilities. And these services, and this is very important, these services should be covered under health insurance. And of course, the private and public facilities should be monitored and given specific guidelines. The third recommendation relates to gestational limits and medical authorization. And our recommendation is that there should be no limits on when you can have an abortion, but in terms of the term of the pregnancy, when you can have the abortion, but medical authorization should be sought for late-term abortion, simply because there are a lot more medical complications that arise with a late-term abortion. And if there is to be medical authorization, ideally not more than 2 doctors should be required. Now, in relation to access for girls, girls should definitely be given access without need for parental authorization. As it relates to access to counseling, the recommendation is that there should be access to pre- and post-care counseling. However, guidelines should indicate that counseling is not intended to discourage women and girls, but to provide information and emotional support. And then in relation to the issue of conscientious objectors, the recommendation is that the law can facilitate having conscientious objectors, but those conscientious objectors should have a legal duty to refer patients to other providers. As it relates to the legal framework, our recommendation is that abortion should be governed by a separate civil legal regime that is divorced from the current criminal law framework. We are also recommending in relation to monitoring that monitoring is mandatory. So an oversight body should be set up and health systems should be given resources, including a budget to implement the actual legislation. And those are the 8 recommendations, and that's the end of my presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anika. Really appreciate that. As you can see, everyone, we have quite a lot of work ahead of us in terms of how restrictive the laws are, and also how the laws are really set up and the laws are in place to control when and how women choose to have a termination, if they choose to have to carry pregnancies. So there is no objection to carrying a pregnancy, but there are objections to choosing not to. So it gives you a sense of the extent to which women's bodies are, the state has a claim in controlling women's bodies. And even though it's our body, the kind of pressure that is brought to bear on women and girls who want to exercise their own will, as they should, in terms of the fact that we do have bodily autonomy, but the way in which we choose to express that bodily autonomy, there's constant barrier and obstacles here and there. You have to jump through the laws. And in jumping through the laws, is that, can create a lot of health risks for women and girls. And because of the health risks, that is also one of the reasons, quickly just to say that today is the International Day of Action for Women's Health. So I wanted us to pay attention to the different ways in which this research that was conducted exposes how laws can have a negative impact on women's health in general, and in a very specific way, paying attention to reproductive health and rights, and the way in which what that does then is present a kind of a precarious way that women exercise citizenship. So our value might only be seen or is really more seen in giving birth, in enhancing the population of our respective countries primarily, and not necessarily in terms of what other roles that women can actually play and contribute to society and in development on a whole. We're not just here to birth the planet. We have other things to do. So I'm going to open the floor. First, I'd like to open the floor to some of our civil society actors that were part of the conversation, part of this project from the get-go. And, if anyone wants to shoot any questions, please feel free to go ahead. If anyone has any comments, go ahead as well. And we'll just take it from there.
And Taitu, as you open the floor, I just want to also recognize on our call, our
please.
program officer, who was responsible for the Equality Justice Alliance program. That's also with Kaleidoscope Trust. Lena is here on the call with us.
Hey.
And, definitely, it has been a good road with her as program lead, leading the civil society aspect. So just want to acknowledge her on the call. And really say thank you so very much for this presentation. And again, it does give a lot in terms of things to be done. Mm-hmm. And right now, as we speak about the recommendations and activities and stuff, apart from the questions, I'll be taking little notes, and hopefully we can also, Taitu, I'll be sending that to you to do the follow-up.
Yes, that's fine. Okay, MH, I see you have a hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning.
Morning.
Let me thank you guys for putting this together. Very informative. The lawyer was making a point which I want her to repeat because I wasn't clear. She said that there was a responsibility for the law to be positive in its kind of lost it there. Can she just give me that again, please? It was very early in the presentation, and it was
Okay.
looking at restrictions to abortion.
Anika, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I mean by they have a positive obligation is something sort of with human rights, the state has both positive and negative obligations as it relates to protecting the human rights of citizens. And in relation to a negative right, all they have to do is refrain from doing something. With a positive obligation, they have to do something in order to effect or guarantee that right. So in relation to them having a positive obligation to put in policies and procedures related to ensuring that women have access to affordable and accessible abortion, they have to not only refrain from not allowing women to have an abortion, but they actually have to put in place measures which will ensure that women are able to access affordable and accessible as well as safe abortion services.
Thank you very much. I thought that's what you meant. I just wanted to make sure that I was getting the legalese correct. And then just to say then that even, you know, the point that I make all the time and we'll just make here so that it can follow through into the recommendations phase is that we have to be very cognizant that law alone doesn't fix this problem or the problems with access to abortion and perception to abortion, as the Barbados case shows. We have a law, but we don't have, like Anika so aptly put it just now, all of those positive requirements, policies, support mechanisms, accountability mechanisms to ensure that that law is enforced to the benefit of women. So in the recommendations moving forward, then cultural change around the treatment of women's right to choice, and how that can then create space for the positive things, inclusive of policy, inclusive of, like I said, support mechanisms in accountability mechanisms, those kinds of things. So definitely something left to be done as we look to move forward.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you so much for that.
And now we have
I think the
Alex.
next, Alex. I saw Alex fan. Alex from War in Antigua. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Alex, you're speaking, but we're not hearing you.
Good morning to everyone. Yes, it's still morning. Good morning to everyone. Can you hear me now?
And we can see you too.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Working from home. I think I should have waited to give other people a chance, but I feel so excited. Having been a part of this process from very early when we met in St. Vincent. And so I want to congratulate the lead team, the consultant, and all other countries and organizations that participated. And Lena, thank you very much to you and your colleagues for the guidance and for the MONEY. As the consultant stated in her research, the only medical or healthcare provider I see mentioned there are doctors. If we can recall, for those of us who would have seen and noted in the Bible, when Moses was found, a call was sent not for the doctor, but for the midwife. And so in this research and going forward, I would want to see how, what role can the midwife play, especially when we're speaking not of surgical interventions, but medical abortions. We need to realize that medical abortions are abortions as well. And it doesn't always have to be the doctor, because it seems as though there is still that power imbalance, as it were, as though the doctor is the end all be all. So I think that midwives should be brought into the loop and the discussions as we go forward to see what their thoughts are and how they too can help in the provision of safe abortions. So once again, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much for that input, Alex. I think that's really, really key, and it speaks to the need for us to pay attention to, you know, when time passes on. Because I think, for instance, if we use Barbados' own as an example, the abortions are by DNCs, not necessarily the medical terminations, and it also asks for the doctors, not just not to include the midwives. And I do believe that you're on the money, on point to include midwives. And it also, in a strange kind of way, the fact that midwives are excluded from that process speaks to the marginalization of midwifery in the care, in the health care of women. So that is a larger conversation in terms of how midwives have not necessarily been an integral part of women's health care, as was the case a couple of decades ago. So I think that is definitely a positive recommendation that we should put forward, because they're much closer to women's bodies, being women themselves, and they're much closer and well-equipped and trained to participate in having terminations. To me, there's really no logical reason outside of patriarchy why they shouldn't be included. So I think it is definitely something that we will put forward in the recommendations. I see a question, or a hand up rather, from Sarah Ann Gresham. Sarah Ann, go ahead, please.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing and informative presentation. So I'm representing Intersect from Antigua. And so I noticed that reference was made to international jurisprudence on men not having the right to be consulted or to veto a vote. And so I was wondering whether recommendations for reform can be attentive to language so that a distinction is made between cisgender, transgender, and gender nonconforming persons, so that gender nonconforming people, so that protections are as inclusive as possible. And I was wondering if there was also space somehow for dialogue that kind of discusses the distinction between legalization and decriminalization, because both are two completely different things.
Can you, sorry, Sarah Ann, can you repeat the question again for me, please?
Oh, can you not hear me?
I didn't hear the first part.
Okay, all right. So reference was made to international jurisprudence on men not having the right to be consulted or to veto a vote. And so I was wondering whether recommendations for reform can be attentive to language, so that you know, we know that there's a distinction between cisgender, transgender, and gender non-conforming people, so that protections are as inclusive as possible. And I was also wondering if there's space for dialogue to talk about the distinction between legalization and decriminalization, which, you know, are two different things.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to ask Anika to respond to the question about the decrim versus legalization. I agree with you that there is need to have a broader discussion on the kind of language that would be recommended for use for legal reform, because generally speaking, the laws, not just in this particular law that we're looking at, it's not gender neutral. So that is definitely a larger conversation that we have to do. So there, on the one side, there's some that say that we should include all of the, you know, the various labels, if it's, you know, all the different women in their diversities, and, you know, instead of listing all the women, or should we just have gender neutral language? So there's that. And there hasn't really been consensus. And then because we have to put, and in law, the language has to be consistent. So I think those are one of the things that we have to really have further discussion about in terms of when we are making recommendations, what kind of language are we going to recommend? You know, bearing in mind that the law of the language, no, the other way around, the language of the law has its own particular standard. So that definitely would be ongoing. Anika, I'm going to leave the next question to you.
Yes, so I do think that there are, there should be a conversation in relation to whether we want to legalize abortion or decriminalize. In relation to what I will note is that in relation to the regimes that we compared with Barbados and Guyana, theirs is not a legalized regime. It's more of a decriminalized regime. So there's still so the position really is that we will allow abortion in specific circumstances that we consider to be progressive. But if you go outside of those circumstances, then you can face criminal penalties. In relation to legalization, which it does not occur within the Caribbean space, there really would not be any sort of criminal law framework governing the actual access to abortion. And instead, what you probably have are policies and procedures relating to how it should operate. One of the things that I'll say in relation to whether you choose the decriminalization or the legalization route is that you always have to remember that with law, law is generally a compromise, is generally, in a lot of times, especially when it relates to contentious issues, it is usually a compromise between different interest groups. And so there are other interest groups that have a vested interest in the abortion debates. And you have to then try to figure out which of those routes will provide a satisfactory compromise to the competing interest groups. So that's my take on that.
And right now we have another question from Renee.
Renee, and after Renee, we have Christina Hines. So Renee, you go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Great presentation. Thank you for putting this all together. I always ask this question, so what are the next steps in presenting this to different agencies and government? And I think in doing that also too, there should be something for education of these agencies on the issues. For instance, I remember Barbados had a situation where, I think it was at the UN, there was a motion dealing with abortion and everybody thought Barbados would have voted for the motion and we actually voted against. I think there's really a need to, outside of just engaging the Ministry of Health and engaging the Attorney General's office on the change in the judicial system, but making sure that also throughout government and the government agencies that deal with the policies, that we educate them and the persons in it as well.
Okay, in terms of, I want the answer regarding the way forward. I think it's a good question to look at closer to the end when we have had more questions, so to speak. But just to say quickly that the publication is one outcome, and then the advocacy is going to form part of the advocacy around the evidence provided for in the publication is part of the way forward. And then there are several of us along in the thread that are active in what happens after we finish, after we, put out the outcome document. So I know it's not a full answer, but that's the answer I can give you now. And then, so I'm going to pass on to Christina Hines. You're next up.
Hi, good day to everyone. My question is just a follow-on question about, well, related to decriminalization versus legalization, because I am wondering, and I'm not a lawyer, whether, for instance, the approach in Barbados and Guyana, although it is decriminalization rather than legalization, if it doesn't function in a lot of ways like legalization. And I mean, in terms of a compromise position, whether this is the best that governments in the region can do, because as Renee just mentioned, there are a lot of this has to do with the religious context and so on in the region. So things like calling, instead of saying abortion, the medical termination of pregnancy, that kind of technical language is kind of a workaround, which allows people to have abortions basically so long as a medical professional is willing to sign off on it and it is within the time period. So my question is kind of like, is this the best that we can do considering the dynamics in the region to get to the point of decriminalization, widening of the scope for decriminalization, because we know there are evangelical groups and Catholic groups and all sorts, Rastafari, people that believe that abortion is wrong, and getting through that is extremely difficult. That's it, I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Christina. Anika, are you going to respond to that one? Because it's against the, yeah. Sorry.
I don't have, I understand Christina, the sentiments that Christina would have expressed in terms of, is this the best we can do in terms of a compromise between those who are advocating for access to abortion services for women and those who are saying this is wrong, this is against God's laws, right? So I understand what she's saying, but what I will add to the conversation as well is, because we live within a pluralistic society, and a pluralistic democracy in which we are attempting to provide protection, and we are attempting to recognize the rights of the different groups within the society. I think what we need to focus on, if you are an advocate for increasing the access to abortion services for women and girls, what you need to focus on is, what is the position that will provide women and girls with the greatest access to services, that will ensure that women and girls' right to access is not being infringed unnecessarily. So what position will guarantee that, and at the same time allow those persons who are vigorously opposed to abortion to feel as if their voices are also being heard, without putting the rights of women and girls at a disadvantage. So I think that is what you need to start thinking about in relation to developing a position that will satisfy both sides. So that's all I will add to that conversation.
Yeah, I think also, if I may add at this point, if we take abortion from the box that it has been placed in, and pay attention to it as a public health issue, because really and truly it's just one aspect of the sexual and reproductive health of women. It's much more, encompassing than that. And one of the challenges that we face is that because they pay attention, some persons don't want to use the term abortion, whereas when we pay attention to whether or not it's a medical abortion, medical termination, or whether or not it's a surgical one, everything kind of gets lumped into one, because the first thing they're thinking of is abortion is such an explosive term. But if we, to me, not pay attention, I've gone along the route of being a part of advocacy processes looking at abortion, to say after a while, you really have to pay attention to the results. What is it saying about the health of the person that requires the service? What is it saying about the barriers that she's facing? What is it saying about the quality of her life if she doesn't get access to the service? What does it say So to me, if we pay attention to what is lost and the fact that we all have a right to health under our Constitution, some of the noise that comes forth, which places more emphasis on the life of the right of the unborn, so to speak, what it essentially is saying is that women don't have a right to health, or we should give up our right to health because the unborn deserve something else or something more. So there's a way in which you have to shift the argument more towards the right to health and public health, and what is lost when we say that a woman's right to health must be subsumed over this one tiny thing. Well, it's not tiny, but this one aspect of her life that somehow she should be able to push aside in order to satisfy the religious conscience of a few. And even that religious conscience debate is still very debatable because it is based on, it's not a public health issue to my mind. It really isn't. So there's a point to which, quite frankly, they should have less impact or less influence. I don't have all the answers there in terms of how we choose not for them to have less impact or less influence, because what ends up happening, in my view, what I've seen is that it literally becomes very divisive, very contentious, and we don't get anywhere. So just shut the door. But my approach is a bit more radical. My thing is, once we're moving towards health, if we pay too much attention to the controversy and what they're saying, which has no end, it creates more division, and then women and girls lose out. If there's another hand up, let me go back to it. Where did I see it? I saw,
Sarah.
was it Sarah? Sorry,
Sarah.
my
Yes.
screen. Sarah,
Yes.
go ahead, please.
Yes.
My bad.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I brought up decrim because I think that the discourse on decrim and legalization goes beyond rights-based advocacy to thinking about how women can end up in compromising with conservatives like the religious community to get something approved and passed and what have you. I'm also thinking about how some women may end up being criminalized under legalization if they do not follow, certain specific procedures under which abortion is allowed, or are allowed rather. And so, there are cases where abortion is legalized, but if women aren't following the correct procedures or they aren't following the specific rules, they can still end up being criminalized and punished. And so that's why I brought up the issue of decrim as the sort of goal that perhaps we should be thinking toward. But I do understand the importance of compromising, but I'm just really concerned that in compromising we can end up reinforcing the same harm that we're trying to avoid.
Absolutely, which is why I don't think there's a point at which you have to choose not to compromise. But it's a difficult thing to navigate, and my own sense of it isn't necessarily going to be everybody else's sense of it. So I myself have to even compromise that. There's a question I see, sorry. There's a question in the group chat. Sharice is asking if any research about long-term effects of multiple abortions on women's health, not just physical health. The short answer is no. One of the main reasons why we decided to go this route of research on abortion in the Eastern Caribbean is twofold. One, there are very huge evidence gaps in terms of abortion in what has happened to our women in terms of abortion in the Eastern Caribbean and the wider Caribbean as well. And we wanted to start to fill that gap. There are individual studies, but they're few and far between. And unfortunately, the law, the restrictive provisions in the law has also impacted the way in which we do research in this area. It's a very sensitive issue. So some persons are not necessarily willing to speak. There are a whole set of other guidelines that we have to follow because of the stigma and because the legislation is restrictive. So that has really and truly affected the research environment. But so it is something that is still needed. There's research in other territories, but not in the Caribbean. So it's definitely something that is still lacking.
That is research part 2, Taitu.
Yes, back to one.
Lena, please take note. I have hands up by Nicole, and we probably will take the next 5 questions, and then close-off presentations. Please note that if you want us to send your copy of this research project, remember to put your email in there. Also, in a few minutes, just before we end, Maria will also put up a link that you can also have the option of being able to go onto the ECADE website and download it. And, you know, it will also be on the Kaleidoscope website, and we'll also try to put it out on our Facebook, Twitter, and what have you. So, but initially, we'd like to make sure those copies come directly to you.
Yes, and it will be on the WAND website as well.
Pardon?
No, I was just saying it's going to be on the WAND website as well. So everybody will have multiple ways. There'll be no reason for you not to get this publication, put it that way.
Oh, definitely.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm not sure if this part of the research was covered, but just in terms of persons answering from their own knowledge, with the reinstitution of the gag order, in terms of funding and stuff like that, do we notice a spike around that time that abortion happens or not? And if possible, with funding restrictions, does that then shift how funding happens? And that may be a scope outside of, but I just wanted to get a sense of how do organizations operate if that was part of this fair? If not, do the numbers spike or not during gag order times? And I'm hoping that persons understand what the gag order is.
No, can you explain a bit, please?
So
the gag order from the US.
So the gag order is
from the US,
when, in the US, because of the fact that most of the money that we get to do support health, mostly for women's health in the region, usually doesn't come from government coffers. I'm just putting it like that. I know some do, but the majority of the work that we do doesn't always come from government. And when right-wing presidents are sitting presidents, we don't get money for abortion services and some other SRE services. So I was wondering, so like when either of the Bushes were sitting presidents, when Trump became president, he reinstated the gag order. So that's a question.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. It would affect it, but not all of the countries, as you rightly put out, were impacted by the gag order. At an ideological level, what I do know is that it didn't affect the countries that legally offer abortion services directly. What they did was that they recorded it in a different way. So instead of calling it a termination, they called it a tubal ligation. So it affects how they record data. So one may argue, is that ethical or unethical? And so that I know happened, I can say that I know happened in Jamaica, in some of the clinics that offered it, in government clinics that had offered it at the time. It can't offer it anymore. And I know that happened in some other countries as well. But the impact of the gag order would have affected it in some level, but I found that some countries, and I don't want to say it generally, because that's not the case. It didn't affect it. It affected indirectly, not directly.
Indirectly and directly, Taitu, because if you look at for the smaller islands, especially the Planned Parenthoods that will be funded directly out of US funding.
Yeah,
a lot
definitely.
of them have been struggling in terms of services provided. It also, in many a times, restricted the kind of research you actually wanted to do, because I think one of the questions that came up, like, for example, is saying, have we actually conducted research on the impact of multiple abortion? Based on that order, plus based on our law that says basically abortions are illegal, it kind of puts people in a tight spot for trying to bring out that kind of level of research. And also the issue of confidentiality still comes back, not just the people, but the doctors being compromised and not being able to do stuff because of the pressure. So I think we have had major impact that we have been trying to navigate and work around to ensure small steps still being taken and done, but there is a deeper impact in terms of the actual reach and access to differently able persons, especially those who may not be able to pay the high prices to private doctors.
Yeah.
And in Barbados as well, it's direct, and it's direct in the sense that our family planning here as well, they tap into a lot of private funding. And I have heard them talk about in the UN forum, I have heard them speak about you know, this presidency and some of the rhetoric and ideology around it, and the impact that that has had on some of their funding sources. So if it's being done through our family planning here, then it would have a direct impact. Alternately, if it's being done through the hospital, which is public funding, that would not be as affected. But then there are other issues with access and abortion through the hospital services.
Thanks so much for that addition, Marcia. There was another, who else was it? Who was it that was just going to come in?
Can I just offer something, Taitu?
Go ahead, please, go ahead.
Yeah. I remember a couple years ago, I think the Netherlands government was offering money to the region for young people for SRH services. So I don't know with the possibility understanding that yes, the gag order may be instituted from time to time, that alternative funding may be something. So we don't look to the north per se in that direction, but we could probably look to Europe, which is a little more amenable to things like that for funding, as a heads up.
Well, thank you so much for that. All of these things about funding are now thrown in the air with COVID. I don't even know whether to laugh or not.
Now a lot of funding redirected to COVID and looking at, okay, well, you know, the one thing about COVID that has been going on, and I'm trying to figure out, you know, a number of people had some memes going around about the names of children after COVID because, you know, they expect that they're gonna have a baby boom for 2020. Maybe more like 2021 by the time these children get born. What does that look like? And then is it also an increase in legal and illegal abortions? Because you're looking at the economic impact also says people are gonna have less funds in hand to actually be able to take care of children moving forward. So what does that actually look like? And I think right now we have 2 hands up. I saw Alex for sure, and we're gonna take that, and then we're gonna have Taitu and Anika just give off the final words before we close off. So, Nicole?
Is it Nicole or is it Alex?
Alex.
Alex, go ahead.
I saw
Thank you very much for indulging me a second time. Kenita, I think you hit the nail right on the head, because in the closing remarks, I would have asked permission to say something like that, because we are seeing from the impact of COVID, one of the things is that the numbers of violence within the family has definitely increased. I could remember Dr. Kamala Kempadu did some research a couple of years ago, and she said that the sexual praxis of the Caribbean people is usually seen in a hard, rough, and strong way. And so most times, and we can see that in some of the songs that we know so well. And so sometimes when a woman or a girl comes to report physical violence, there more than likely would have been sexual violence also. But because of the way the police and different agencies look at persons when they report sexual violence, people tend to downplay the sexual violence and just focus on the physical violence, especially if there's evidence, like a cut, a bruise, a scar, or something like that. And so, yes, we are going to have a lot of unplanned pregnancies, because we have to remember that due to the recent unemployment and unemployment which existed before, people have to eat. And so a woman coming home to 5 pairs of eyes looking at her, who is not in the public service, she has to feed her children. And so we have to look at things like transactional sex, and we have to look at commercial sex. We have to look and see how many NGOs still have their doors open, and how accessibility to condoms, what is the degree or what is the level. So yes, we have to plan ahead for those. And we also have to plan ahead for the emotional, psychological, and mental impact of what is going on right now and what will continue for some time to come. So yes, this launch could not have come at a better time from my perspective for us to take it forward, because we always had solid grounds, but now with COVID in the mix, it gives us some more statistics, real statistics, to help to push it forward. And if I may, through you, Chair, to Rennie, the voting that took place at UN, lots of times is because the people in our missions, they take a position on certain issues. And so that is another group that we also have to teach and help them to understand at a granular level how the lives of women and girls are being negatively impacted. So thank you. I will speak again. Thank you.
Thank you
Alex,
so much,
I just
Alex.
want to say on that note, where the UN and the OS is concerned, although most times we'd like to say is our ambassadors, but sometimes our representatives from foreign affairs, gender affairs also flies up. And so it's not always the ambassadors, but we have to look at our country reps within every section.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the mission reps.
Yes.
A lot of the mission reps.
I saw a question I saw Lena's hands up.
Oh, please. It would be great to hear from Lena.
Kanita, I was just, Alex said exactly what I was going to say, so I'm not even going to say anything, just the fact that I think we should be conscious of the fact that so many people are probably having unplanned pregnancies, both consensual as well as those arising out of sexual violence. And it's just something to bear in mind, that this is a window of opportunity. And I just wanted to say, Alex, it's been a pleasure giving the money, or at least helping the UK government acknowledge the awful things that they've done in the past, and helping spend that money and working with everyone in the Caribbean. So thank you, and thanks to Anika and Taitu as well for the report.
Thanks, Lena. One of the things that when we had just started this research project, right, all 3 areas, mental health, anti-discrimination, and abortion, COVID was nowhere near in sight, at least not on our immediate horizons. So when this component, the abortion component, was finished, the recommendations that were given didn't include anything about COVID, but the launch is now happening right in the mix of COVID. So I think we really do have to rethink what are the implications now, because COVID is also here. And as I see a question here from the chat coming out, and I'm going to read it out loud because I think it's a very important question. What do abortion services look like in COVID? So it has to be answered or looked at in 2 different ways. In countries that don't have abortion as something that is legal and accessible to all, and in countries that do have abortion services that are legal and accessible. Well,
and then even the third aspect of What does it look like during lockdown?
During lockdown, yes, that's what I'm saying. So in looking at answering that question, we have to look at it from those who don't have it accessible legally and those who have it accessible legally, because it complicates the picture. Because under lockdown, what services are open? When can you go? How do you get there? There are a whole heap of other set of variables that have to be considered. You know, so if it is not legal, it complicates the picture even more. So I think myself and Anika, we're gonna have to knock our heads, and with the input coming out from this discussion, and definitely have to knock our heads and add a bit to, you know, the recommendations and the summary, because we are now going to be having, you know, it's going to be published and the advocacy work is going to be done in this COVID dispensation. Not in the new normal, because ain't nothing normal about what's happening, in the new different, right? So I think I will close there. I don't know if Anika has any.
Taitu, you have one last, we are making a break for the last hand raise.
Where? Let me see.
Time.
No,
Madam
yes, we have time. We have 50 more minutes. So, where is it? I missed it. Miss Monique. Monique, please go ahead, Monique.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I just want to congratulate you on this one work that you're doing. I'm really, really, really about everything that I'm hearing, all the conversations that are going on right now. I just wanted to add a thought as well. And with regards to abortion, I know that specifically we are looking at the legal frameworks, but also early session abortion, and it's also thing about not abortion care, abortion types of slang. Yes, but all we are very really community and maybe lose not really but also
Monique, I pause a second. Can you hear? Monique, we're not hearing you very clearly at all.
Yeah. Oh.
No. The quest
no.
It's a lot of breaking up. I can guarantee
you.
Can
you just try to say a whole sentence now? Let's just try again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We can hear that, so go ahead.
God,
if it doesn't work, then we'll ask you to type the question. That's much better. Go ahead.
Okay, no, fine. So you heard that part about congratulate everybody. This is work that you're doing. And only thing to on to raise the here in terms of and having play like patient care and having that part of the conversation. That does not necessarily mean you know, formal counseling, but also in terms of spiritual and religious healing. I know that the faith-based organizations are generally against terminations, but I think they need to be considered as allies as well, because of our women who are having are so they would need that of care, reaching spiritual. So that came also to you know that there's a lot going on, especially because the internal.
Monique, you're gone again. You're gone again. It's sorry.
Sorry, I know it must be so frustrating.
So important,
Monique,
but we are not.
No,
we're taking out.
Yeah, I know it must be frustrating, but is it possible for you to type the question?
But yes, I'll type it.
Yeah, sorry about it, but it's really breaking up. So we're going to lose a possible really brilliant question. I don't think we should. So it might be best if you just type it.
All right, while she's typing it, Anika, any last summary from you? And then Taitu, over to you. Because the internet is starting to become a little unstable now, so yes.
Okay, so first of all, I would just like to say that it was a pleasure to work on the review with Taitu and also with Kenita and the Abortion Technical Working Group. So first and foremost, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I am very excited about the next steps in the advocacy, which I suspect based on our discussion this morning would include, among other things, the insightful recommendations related to that question of decriminalization versus legalization, and which approach should we take? Are we satisfied with the compromise position that we have in Barbados and Guyana, or should we be looking for a more progressive, an approach that is more progressive than the current progressive approach? I'm also excited in relation to advocacy on the inclusion of all healthcare providers, not just doctors, in terms of providing abortion services, and as well as the inclusion in terms of our language and in terms of our advocacy, the inclusion of binary and non-binary people in how we frame access to abortion services. And finally, I am of course looking forward to how we will deal with the very pertinent issue as it relates to the effects of COVID and other disasters, I might say, on the access to abortion services. So again, thank you to everyone for the insightful discussion.
Thanks to you as well, Anika. We all appreciated the presentation this morning. Thank you so much for all the questions and comments that we got. I wasn't able to look at everything, but the ones that I saw, I really appreciate the insightful comments and questions that came forward. And from members of the technical team, that technical working group that participated and gave really great questions. Thanks for going with the long haul. I see Monique is giving us the last thing to think about, and I think Monique's comment is really good for us to end on. She was basically saying that a lot of the international agencies are looking at webinars, using the webinar space because of COVID, and that there is an interagency working group on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and perhaps that is, an angle that we can consider for future discussions and perhaps for future advocacy. And so we'll take that, and perhaps we can talk with Monique Springer a bit more. She's at UA Harp. We can talk with Monique a little bit more to see how we can get that moving. And I think we can end it here, but I want to say thank you so much for everybody for participating. Thanks to the Equality and Justice Alliance for facilitating the research. Thanks as well to Kaleidoscope Trust for trusting us with the research and letting us move forward. Doing work regionally is always a challenge, but I think it is worth it because, especially in terms of where things are going now, I believe we're going in a direction where we're going to have to rely more and more on each other. And so we will have to, stay focused on the things that are important, such as human rights, in my view. Human rights must be integral to development. There's no such thing as development without human rights access and guarantee. So I think on that note, we could probably end there. And with Kenita from ECADE, as you can see, what all the email addresses going out, we will ensure that you can get the soft copy of the publication, and it will be going out on the various websites at a later date, very soon. So you'll have access to the publication very soon. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you can't go out,
in terms of resources tied to.
Sorry?
So right now there's the diversity and inclusion manual. There's gap analysis on the mental health, and then there's also this abortion research, all pieces of the EJ project coming out of our 2-year push of work. And in June, please look out for the legal literacy manual that will be launching then, and you will all get the links and info for it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Thanks
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Bye.
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 Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Bye. ECADE, stay on the line. You know that's going to happen, right? I always ask you to stay on the line. There's always a post meeting.